You ever see a mark that shouldn't exist, but somehow everyone important already knows it? The bell above the diner door gave a dull chime as the old man stepped inside, carrying nothing but the quiet weight of years most people in the room couldn't begin to measure. It was late afternoon just outside Fort Liberty, the kind of hour when sunlight stretched long across the vinyl booths and the air smelled faintly of coffee that had been sitting too long on a hot plate. A group of Delta Force operators occupied the far corner, their presence obvious without a single word spoken, clean haircuts, squared shoulders, the kind of stillness that came from training, not comfort. Staff Sergeant Cole Mercer leaned back in his seat, boots planted firm against the tiled floor, watching the old man with the casual curiosity of someone who believed he had already seen everything worth seeing. The man moved slowly, not weak, just deliberate, like every step had already been considered before it happened. He slid into a booth near the window, the sunlight catching the edge of his sleeve as he reached for a menu he didn't seem interested in reading. One of the younger operators nudged Mercer, a subtle tilt of the chin toward the old man's forearm where the cuff had shifted just enough to reveal something inked into the skin. It wasn't bold or fresh like modern tattoos. It was faded, worn down by decades, its lines softened into something almost unrecognizable unless you were looking for it. Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in that sharp, predatory focus that came from spotting something out of place. He stood, casual, confident, and crossed the diner in a few easy steps, stopping just short of the booth. "That's an interesting piece of ink," he said, voice light but edged with something colder underneath. The old man didn't look up right away. He folded the menu, set it aside, and then raised his eyes, pale, steady, and far too calm for someone being approached that way. "It's just something from a long time ago," he replied, his voice low, gravelly, like it had been shaped by years of saying only what needed to be said. Mercer let out a quiet chuckle, glancing back at his team before leaning slightly closer. "Funny," he said, pointing loosely toward the mark, "because I've seen a lot of unit symbols, and that one doesn't exist." A couple of the operators behind him shifted, their attention sharpening now, drawn in by the tone more than the words. The old man's gaze didn't waver, didn't challenge, didn't retreat. It simply stayed, as if Mercer's presence changed nothing about the room. "That's because it wasn't meant to," he said. The answer hung there, heavier than it should have been. Mercer's smirk didn't fade, but something behind his eyes adjusted, recalibrating. He reached out then, not aggressively, just enough to brush the edge of the faded lines with a single finger. The movement was small, casual, but the reaction wasn't. The old man's hand closed around Mercer's wrist, not tight, not threatening, just firm enough to stop the motion completely. The diner seemed to quiet without anyone realizing it had. "Don't," the old man said softly. And for the first time since he'd stood up, Mercer didn't immediately respond. Mercer did not pull his hand away right away, not because he could not, but because something in that grip did not feel like resistance, it felt like control, measured and absolute, the kind that did not need force to make its point, and the longer it lasted the more the room seemed to lean toward it. Conversations fading into a low hum as silverware paused halfway to plates and eyes drifted without permission toward the booth by the window where something unspoken was taking shape. The old man released him after a second that felt longer than it should have, his hand returning to the table as if nothing had happened, as if that brief moment had not shifted the balance in a room full of men trained to dominate every situation they entered. Mercer straightened slowly, rolling his wrist once, not out of pain but out of recalculation, his confidence still there but no longer careless, now sharpened, focused, like a blade that had just met something harder than expected. "You always grab people like that," he said, his tone quieter now, less for show and more for understanding, and the old man gave the smallest shake of his head, not defensive, not apologetic, just certain. "Only when they forget what they are touching," he replied, and the words landed with a weight that did not belong in a roadside diner, drawing a brief glance between the operators behind Mercer, subtle but real, the kind of look professionals shared when something did not add up. One of them, a younger sergeant sitting at the edge of the booth, leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to study the faded lines of the tattoo from a distance, not mocking, not dismissing, just curious in a way that came from instinct rather than ego. Mercer noticed it, of course he did, and it pushed him a step further, not back, because stepping back was not in his nature. You saying it means something, he pressed, folding his arms now, creating space but not leaving it, because I have worked with units most people do not even know exist. And I have never seen that symbol in any archive, any briefing, or any patch wall, and that was not a boast, it was a statement of fact, delivered the way men like him spoke when they knew their credentials could not be questioned. The old man's eyes drifted for a moment, not to Mercer, not to the team, but to the window where the sunlight had begun to shift, stretching longer across the pavement outside, and when he spoke again his voice carried something quieter, something older. That is because some things were never meant to be recorded, he said, and this time even the younger operator stopped trying to hide his interest, his posture tightening as if he had just heard something that triggered a memory he could not fully reach. The waitress behind the counter, Linda, had been wiping the same glass for nearly a minute now, her attention fixed not on the task but on the table, her expression changing in small ways that most people would miss. But not someone who had spent years watching people pass through that diner, learning who was ordinary and who carried something else entirely, and she had seen that look before, not often, but enough to recognize it, the kind of stillness that did not come from age but from experience that never really left. Mercer exhaled slowly, glancing once more at the tattoo, then back at the old man, and for the first time there was no humor in his expression, only a quiet challenge. Then maybe you should explain it, he said, and the old man finally looked directly at him again, steady and unshaken. No, he answered, simple, final, and the refusal did not escalate the moment, it deepened it, turning curiosity into tension, and tension into something else entirely, something that began to settle over the room like a pressure system rolling in, unseen but impossible to ignore. The words settled between them with a finality that did not invite argument, and that alone was enough to shift the atmosphere from confrontation into something more dangerous, something quieter, because men like Mercer were used to resistance, they were trained for it, but calm refusal without explanation was something else entirely. He studied the old man again, this time not as a curiosity but as a problem that did not fit any familiar pattern, and behind him one of the operators shifted in his seat, a subtle movement that carried more weight than it seemed, the younger sergeant leaning forward just a fraction more as if trying to catch a clearer look at the faded ink that had suddenly become the center of gravity in the room. You are telling me there is no record, no unit, no designation, Mercer said slowly, each word chosen more carefully now, and I am supposed to believe it just exists, and the old man did not respond immediately, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, the same steady stillness holding him in place as if time itself moved differently around him. Outside, a truck rolled past on the road, its engine noise low and distant, and for a brief second it felt louder than it should have, like the world was reminding everyone that something ordinary was still happening beyond the glass. Inside, the younger operator finally spoke, his voice cutting in with a hesitation that did not match the confidence of the others. Staff Sergeant. That shape, he said, not finishing the thought right away as his eyes narrowed, trying to align memory with what he was seeing. I saw something like it once, not in a file, not official, more like a briefing reference that got shut down fast, and Mercer's head turned slightly, not sharply, but enough to acknowledge that this was no longer just his conversation. You are sure? Mercer asked without looking at him directly, and the younger man exhaled, uncertain but compelled. No, not sure, just, it was flagged, like something you are not supposed to ask about. And that was enough to deepen the silence rather than break it. The old man's gaze shifted briefly toward the younger operator, not with surprise, not even with recognition, but with something closer to acknowledgement, as if the mention of it had confirmed a truth he had never intended to explain. Mercer caught that look, and it did not sit well with him, because it suggested there was a layer here he was not controlling, and control was something he did not give up easily. So now it is classified folklore, Mercer said, a faint edge returning to his voice, though it no longer carried the same confidence it had when he first stood up, a symbol that nobody can explain but everybody is supposed to respect. And he paused, letting the words hang, watching for a reaction that did not come. The old man simply reached for the coffee that had been placed on the table without anyone noticing when it arrived, lifting the cup with steady hands and taking a slow sip, unbothered, unhurried, as if the tension surrounding him belonged to someone else entirely. Linda watched that movement from behind the counter, her grip tightening slightly around the glass she had been holding, because she had seen that kind of calm before, not in ordinary people, but in men who had already faced things that made arguments like this meaningless. Mercer followed the motion of the cup, then back to the tattoo, and for the first time there was a flicker of something he did not immediately recognize, not doubt exactly, but the beginning of it, the smallest crack in certainty. Then let me ask you something else, he said, quieter now, leaning just slightly forward, not to intimidate, but to close the distance between question and answer. If it does not exist, why did you tell me not to touch it? And the old man lowered the cup, setting it back onto the table with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been, his eyes lifting once more to meet Mercer's, steady as ever. Because some marks are not for remembering, he said, his voice calm, almost reflective, they are for surviving, and this time, no one in the room moved at all. The words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the space between them like something heavier than sound, and for a moment even Mercer did not have an answer ready, which was unusual for a man who had built his reputation on staying one step ahead of uncertainty. He leaned back slightly this time, not retreating but reassessing, his eyes narrowing just enough to show that the conversation had moved beyond curiosity and into something he could not easily categorize, and behind him the younger operator shifted again, this time reaching slowly for his phone under the table, not in a way that drew attention, but deliberate, careful, like he was acting on instinct rather than instruction. The old man did not follow the movement, did not react to the subtle change in the room, his focus remaining exactly where it had been, steady, grounded, untouched by the rising tension around him. Mercer exhaled quietly, running his tongue once along the inside of his cheek as he studied the lines of the tattoo again, committing them to memory now, each faded curve and intersection that had somehow triggered a reaction he had not expected from himself or his team. Surviving what? Mercer asked finally, his voice lower, less confrontational now but far more serious, because the answer mattered in a way he had not anticipated when he first stood up. The old man did not answer right away, and when he did, it was not with details, not with explanation, but with something that felt older than the question itself. Things that do not get written down, he said, and there was no mystery in his tone, no attempt to be cryptic, just a simple statement of fact that somehow made the room feel smaller. The younger operator's phone screen dimly lit beneath the table as he typed quickly, his thumb moving with a quiet urgency, sending an image he had just captured of the tattoo, his eyes flicking up only once to make sure no one had noticed, but Linda had, her gaze sharp in a way that did not match her usual calm, and though she said nothing, her hand slowly reached beneath the counter where an old phone rested, one she rarely used, her fingers hovering over it as if deciding whether this moment had crossed a line she recognized. Mercer caught a glimpse of movement but chose not to call it out. Not yet, because something told him that pushing too hard now would not give him answers, it would shut them down completely. Instead, he shifted his stance, placing one hand lightly on the back of the booth across from the old man, grounding himself, anchoring the conversation in something physical while everything else felt like it was drifting into unknown territory. You expect me to just accept that, he said, not as a challenge this time, but as a genuine question, one that carried the weight of a professional who understood that not knowing could be more dangerous than being wrong. The old man's eyes met his again, and there was something there now, not warning, not threat, but recognition, as if he had seen this moment before in another place, another time, with another young man standing where Mercer stood now. No, he said quietly, I expect you to remember it, and that answer did something subtle but undeniable. It shifted the purpose of the conversation entirely, from seeking truth to carrying it, and Mercer felt it even if he could not explain why. Outside, the light had begun to soften, the long shadows stretching further across the pavement, and inside the diner the air felt thicker, like something was building just beneath the surface, something that had not yet revealed itself but was already changing the way everyone in that room understood what they were looking at, and somewhere, far beyond the walls of that small diner, a message had already begun moving up a chain that did not usually respond this quickly. The message did not stop when it left the younger operator's phone. It moved, quiet and fast, through channels that rarely lit up without reason. And somewhere far beyond the diner, screens that were not meant for routine traffic flickered with a single image that should not have triggered anything, yet did. Inside, nothing outwardly changed, the same low hum of refrigeration units, the faint clink of glass against metal, but the stillness around the old man had deepened into something deliberate, as if the room itself was holding its breath without knowing why. Mercer felt it, even if he could not name it, that subtle shift where control was no longer entirely his, and it did not sit well with him, not because he felt threatened, but because he felt unprepared, and that was a condition he avoided at all costs. He straightened slightly, his posture resetting into something more formal without him realizing it, the casual edge from earlier gone, replaced by a sharper awareness that every word now mattered. "You keep talking like this is something bigger than it looks," he said. His voice measured, no longer pushing but probing. "But you are sitting here alone in a roadside diner, so either this is nothing, or it is something that disappeared a long time ago." And that was not an insult, it was an attempt to anchor the situation back into something he could understand. The old man's eyes held his, unblinking, steady, and there was no offense in them, only a quiet certainty that did not need defense. "Some things do not disappear," he said. "They just stop being spoken about," and that answer did not escalate the tension, it refined it, stripping away the noise until only the core of the moment remained. Behind Mercer, the younger operator's phone vibrated once against the underside of the table, a soft, controlled buzz that he felt more than heard, and his hand tightened slightly around it, his eyes flicking down for the briefest moment before returning forward. But that single glance was enough to tell him everything had changed. He did not open the message right away, did not react outwardly, because instinct told him this was no longer something to handle casually. This was something to observe, to let unfold. Linda saw it too, not the message itself, but the shift in posture, the way the younger operator had gone from curious to alert in less than a second, and that was enough for her to make a decision, her hand moving quietly to the old phone beneath the counter, dialing a number she had not used in years, one she kept for reasons she never explained, her voice low when it connected. "You might want to check something," she said, offering no details, because she did not need to, and then she hung up before a response could come. Mercer's attention remained fixed on the old man, but something in the air was pulling at his focus now, something he could not see but could feel building, like pressure before a storm. "You are asking me to remember something I do not understand," he said, his tone steady, but there was a shift there now, a trace of respect beginning to edge its way in despite his resistance. "And you are not giving me a reason why," and the old man leaned back slightly, the vinyl seat creaking under the small movement, his hands resting calmly on the table as if nothing around him required urgency. "Understanding is not always required," he said. "Sometimes recognizing is enough," and that word lingered, heavier than the rest, because it implied something Mercer had not yet admitted. That part of him already knew this was not ordinary, that something about that faded mark had reached deeper than logic, and before he could respond, the distant sound of a vehicle pulling sharply into the gravel lot outside broke the fragile stillness, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, controlled, and timed in a way that made every trained instinct in the room quietly take notice. The sound outside did not belong to chance, it was too controlled, too precise, the kind of arrival that did not need to announce itself because the right people would feel it before they ever saw it, and inside the diner that feeling moved through the room like a current, subtle but unmistakable to those trained to notice it. Mercer's head turned slightly toward the window, not fully, just enough to catch the reflection in the glass. A dark vehicle settling into place with the quiet authority of something that did not need permission to be there, and behind him the younger operator finally looked down at his phone, the message now open, his eyes scanning quickly before freezing for a fraction of a second that he could not quite hide. The text was short, almost dismissively so, but the classification tag at the top was enough to override everything else, a level he had only seen a handful of times in his career, and beneath it a single line that made his throat tighten without understanding why: "Do not engage. Stand down. Await arrival." He did not speak, did not react outwardly, but the shift in him was immediate, his posture straightening, his earlier curiosity replaced by something more disciplined, more careful, and that change did not go unnoticed. Mercer saw it, not the screen, but the reaction, and that was enough to tell him that whatever this was had already moved beyond his control, beyond his authority, and into a space where questions were no longer answered directly. "What did you just get?" Mercer asked quietly, his tone controlled but edged with something sharper now, not impatience, but urgency, and the younger operator hesitated for half a second before locking his phone and slipping it back into his pocket. "Nothing confirmed yet," he replied, which was not entirely untrue, but it was not the whole truth either. The old man watched none of this, or at least appeared not to, his attention still resting in that same calm space he had occupied since the beginning, as if the arrival outside, the message, the shifting tension, were all part of something he had already anticipated. Linda's eyes flicked toward the door now, her hand resting lightly on the counter, her breathing slower, more deliberate, as if she understood that whatever was about to happen did not belong to the everyday rhythm of her diner. Mercer turned back fully this time, facing the old man again, but the energy had changed. The casual challenge from before replaced by something quieter, more deliberate. "You Expecting someone, he asked, and it was not sarcasm, not anymore. It was a real question. The old man met his gaze, and for the first time there was something almost like acknowledgement in his expression, not surprise, not concern, just recognition of a moment reaching its natural point. "I am not the one who called them," he said, his voice steady, and the answer was as close to confirmation as Mercer was going to get. Outside, a second vehicle rolled in behind the first, positioning itself with the same quiet precision, and now even the untrained eyes in the diner began to notice that something was different, that this was not a random stop, not a coincidence, but a coordinated arrival that carried weight without explanation. Mercer exhaled slowly, his instincts pulling in two directions, one telling him to press harder, to take control of the situation before it moved further away from him, the other telling him to hold, to observe, because whatever was coming was already bigger than the room they were standing in. The old man reached for his coffee again, lifting it with the same unhurried motion, taking a small sip as if time had not accelerated around him, as if nothing outside those walls demanded his attention. And that calm did more to shift the balance than any display of force ever could. Then the bell above the door rang again, sharp this time, cutting clean through the silence, and every head in the diner turned at once as the door began to open. The door did not swing open with force, it moved with controlled precision, stopping just enough to let a single figure step through before closing again behind him with a soft, deliberate click that sounded louder than it should have in the silence. The man who entered did not need to raise his voice or adjust his posture to command attention, it happened automatically. The kind of presence that rewrote the atmosphere of a room simply by existing within it, and every trained instinct inside. Mercer's team recognized it before their minds fully caught up. His uniform was not ceremonial, not exaggerated, but unmistakable. The weight of rank carried not in decoration but in the way he moved, each step measured, grounded, as if the floor itself had already been accounted for. Conversations that had barely begun to recover died again without instruction, and even those who did not understand why felt it, that subtle pressure that demanded stillness without ever asking for it. Mercer straightened fully now, not out of obligation but reflex, years of discipline aligning his posture before he consciously chose it, his eyes locking onto the newcomer as recognition began to form, not from familiarity, but from the undeniable authority that surrounded him. The younger operator felt it even stronger, his breath catching slightly as the message on his phone replayed in his mind, the phrase "await arrival" suddenly carrying a clarity it had lacked just moments ago. The man's gaze moved across the room once, not searching, not scanning, but identifying, and when it reached the booth by the window it stopped, not abruptly, but with quiet certainty, like the end of a calculation that had already been solved. He did not speak immediately, did not acknowledge anyone else in the room, his focus settling on the old man with a stillness that mirrored his own. For a brief second nothing happened, no movement, no words, just two men looking at each other across a distance that felt far greater than the few feet between them. Mercer noticed it, the absence of hesitation, the absence of surprise, and that absence said more than any introduction could have. The old man did not rise, did not shift, he simply set his coffee cup down with the same steady motion he had used before, his eyes meeting the newcomers without change, as if this moment had already existed long before anyone else became aware of it. Then, without announcement, without command, Mercer's entire team came to attention, not because they were told to, but because something deeper than instruction demanded it, something ingrained that recognized authority at a level beyond rank alone. Mercer followed half a second later, his body aligning with the others, though his eyes never left the two men at the center of the room. The newcomer took one more step forward, closing the distance, and as he did, he slowly rolled back the sleeve of his uniform, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate, revealing the inside of his forearm. The mark there was not fresh, not sharp, but unmistakable, the same faded lines, the same shape that should not have existed, now mirrored perfectly in a place no one in that room had expected to see it. No one spoke, no one moved, because the meaning did not need explanation. It landed all at once, heavy and absolute, and for the first time since this began, Mercer understood that this was never about proving anything, it was about recognizing something that had been there all along. The moment did not explode, it settled, heavy and undeniable, like a truth that had finally stepped into the light without needing permission, and no one in the room questioned it because no one could. Mercer's eyes locked onto the matching mark, his mind running through every possibility it had relied on before and finding nothing that could explain what he was seeing, not error, not coincidence, not imitation, because the way the two men stood across from each other carried something far beyond symbols, it carried history. The general did not lower his sleeve immediately. He let it remain there just long enough for every trained eye in the room to confirm what instinct had already accepted. Then he rolled it back down with the same measured control he had entered with, his gaze never leaving the old man. For a brief second, something almost imperceptible passed between them, not spoken, not visible, but understood. The kind of recognition that did not belong to rank or title, but to something shared long before either of those things mattered. Mercer felt it without understanding it, and that was the moment his certainty gave way completely, not collapsing, but realigning, shifting from challenge into acknowledgement, because whatever this was, it was no longer something he could question in the way he had before. Slowly, almost unconsciously, he took a step back, not in retreat, but in respect, creating space that had not been there earlier, and behind him the rest of his team remained still, their posture held not by discipline alone, but by something deeper, something that recognized the weight of what stood in front of them. The younger operator's breathing steadied as realization settled in, the message on his phone no longer abstract but confirmed in the most direct way possible, and for the first time since this began, he understood why the instruction had been so clear, why it had carried no explanation, because explanation was not necessary when recognition would do the work. Linda remained behind the counter, her hands resting quietly now, her earlier tension replaced by a calm that mirrored the old man's, because whatever had been set into motion had reached its point of balance. The general took one final step forward, closing the distance completely, and though he outranked every person in that room by an immeasurable margin, he did not assert it, did not announce it. Instead he did something far more powerful, something that did not need words. He brought his hand up in a clean, precise motion and held it there, a salute not given lightly, not offered casually, but executed with a level of intent that made its meaning unmistakable. The room did not react at first, not because they did not see it, but because they needed a fraction of a second to process what it meant. And then, almost as one, Mercer and his entire team followed, their movements sharp, aligned, silent, not commanded, but compelled. The old man did not return the salute right away. He simply looked at the general for a moment longer, as if measuring something that did not need to be spoken, and then, with the same quiet control he had shown from the beginning, he raised his own hand and completed the gesture. No one spoke. No one moved beyond that, because nothing needed to be added. The meaning had already filled the space completely, and in that silence, the entire balance of the room had shifted from doubt into respect without a single word being required. The salute did not end the moment, it defined it, holding the room in a quiet stillness that felt less like an interruption and more like a conclusion that had been waiting to happen long before anyone stepped through that door. And when the old man lowered his hand, the movement was unhurried, precise, carrying the same calm certainty that had been there from the beginning. The general followed a fraction of a second later, his posture easing just enough to signal that what needed to be acknowledged had already been done, and for a brief moment the two men simply stood there, not as ranks, not as titles, but as something older, something that did not require explanation to be understood. Mercer slowly lowered his own hand, the tension in his shoulders releasing in a way that surprised him, not because the situation had resolved, but because he finally understood that it had never been his to control in the first place, and that realization did not diminish him. It refined him, grounding his instincts in something deeper than authority alone. He took one step forward, measured, respectful, stopping just short of the booth where the old man still stood, and though he did not speak immediately, the shift in his presence was clear, the earlier edge gone, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement that needed no formal apology. The old man met his gaze once more, and this time there was something almost imperceptible in his expression, not approval, not dismissal, just acceptance, as if this outcome had always been the only one that mattered. Behind them, the rest of the team eased out of their rigid stance, not breaking discipline, but allowing the moment to settle into something that could exist beyond it, their eyes no longer searching for answers, because they had already been given in the only way that counted. Linda exhaled softly behind the counter, her shoulders relaxing as she reached for another glass, the familiar rhythm of the diner slowly returning, though not entirely the same, because something in the air had shifted, something that would linger long after the vehicles outside had gone. The general gave a small nod to the old man, not formal, not ceremonial, but personal, then turned without another word, his presence moving back toward the door with the same quiet authority he had entered with, and as it opened again, the late afternoon light stretched across the floor in a long, golden line that seemed to mark the end of something unseen. The old man watched him go for a second. then reached for his coffee once more, taking a slow, steady sip as if the world had returned to its proper pace, and when he set the cup down, he rose from the booth with the same deliberate calm, adjusting his sleeve without hurry, the faded mark hidden again beneath fabric where it had always belonged. Mercer stepped aside without thinking, creating space without being asked, his eyes following the old man as he moved toward the door, not with curiosity anymore, but with respect that had settled into something permanent. No one stopped him, no one spoke, because nothing needed to be said, and as the bell above the door gave one final, soft chime, the old man stepped out into the fading light and disappeared into a world that would never fully understand what had just passed through it. Mercer remained where he was for a moment longer, the image of that mark still clear in his mind, not as a mystery anymore, but as something to be remembered, something that did not require explanation to carry meaning. And as he finally turned back to his team, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a quiet understanding that would stay with them long after this day was over. Respect is not something that is demanded or declared, it is something recognized, often too late, and sometimes in the quietest places, by those who are willing to see it.